That brings us to informational items and reports. We will begin with a report on the budget calendar. Mrs. Danig.
Thank you, President Boswell. I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Standish, but I'm going to first start with a kind of an introduction. This year with the budget calendar, there's a whole lot of moving parts, pieces and parts as we get it prepared. And we've tried to add several different opportunities for people to give comments. And Dr. Standish is going to highlight those. So if you wait till you get your pink postcard in the beginning of September, it's 99.9% too late to change our budget because of the statutory requirements that we have to get a budget approved. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Standish, and I'm going to say that pink postcard things 100 times over the next 3 months.
Thank you, Mrs. Danik. As you'll recall, one of the reasons we changed the board policy for when the budget calendar would be presented from February to March is because we know March is when we really learn a lot more about what we're looking forward to in the school district. So we wanted this presentation to highlight more than the budget calendar. We wanted to make sure that we were able to talk about opportunities for community engagement. We want to go ahead and kind of foreshadow out when people could expect the pink postcard hearing to be and demonstrate how that is so incredibly late in the budget process, statutorily required by state law, that really engaging in the district's community engagement in June and July is really when we can have a significant impact in the conversation. We also know that when we get to this point of the year, March 1 is typically the day for certification of state aid. So under current law, we do have the certified state aid picture, and we've talked about that before. The other thing that's kind of interesting to think about that we wanted to begin to highlight in the spring is that we are now in the window where if someone's interested in the homestead exemption, they should be looking into and researching that. So we have some information on where to go. Once we get to September, that window has closed. So we just wanted to make sure that we highlighted that information, and then we have legislative update and follow-up from our last meeting. So this is what we call our milestone document. I understand that this is not super readable in this format. It is available as a separate attachment. But the goal here is really highlight that there's a lot of activity that occurs in the financial planning, forecasting, and budget of the school district year round. So there's a lot of activity from staff, reviewing, monitoring information, engaging in negotiations. We really do the school district public information there. Late June is when we have the information available for the next school year, and then we follow the statutory process in September, which is actually a month after the school year has started for the budget that we need to adopt. So we're going to break it out month by month this year. One point of feedback we had is just the long list of dates wasn't as reader friendly. And so I think Mrs. Byerwith was with me at the pink postcard hearing when we had that feedback, and we're like, that's absolutely something we can change. So we're in March, and we have the Board of Education Committee meeting. We're presenting the calendar, and we're going to highlight and have this calendar available on the website. We'll make sure that we have the information out for the public. April and May will be behind the scenes work where Kim Schmidt, the budget team, the finance team is gathering information, and we are bringing forward ideas and concepts and kind of vetting what that preliminary proposed budget working with the finance committee could look like. We do a series of board one-on-ones, and so then we roll out what is called the preliminary proposed budget at a work session on June 25th at 4:30. That is broadcast, that is the public can attend the work session, and we have a board meeting that night as well, which would have an opportunity for public comment. We are also going to launch more of an online window, kind of formalize, here's our budget information, give us feedback. We've always had information on the website. We've always been open to feedback. We've had Let's Talk, people call me, but we're gonna more formalize it this year, somewhat in a survey fashion so that people can interact a little bit differently. I'm gonna work with our amazing communications team on that. That will launch on June 26th. We will continue with a virtual public forum at noon where you can access it on the district website. We will have an in-person event that night on the 26th at 6 o'clock, and then we will have a virtual access through the district website at 6 o'clock on the 27th. So we will do a big push the end of June with our preliminary proposed budget, presenting that to the community and soliciting feedback from the community. We are going to close that online window of input process on July 12th. That does not mean we're closed to feedback. That just means we need to compile the responses we received and work with the finance committee, work with exec committee on what will be the proposed budget July 23rd. So that gives us a window of opportunity to do that. There will still be opportunity for public comment at the Board of Education meeting at that night as well, when you think about your work session. And then as we go into August, we have our 2 regularly scheduled Board of Education meetings where you have options for public comment. We also have our formal budget hearing, which is statutorily required to be on a night other than a Board of Education meeting. So in August, there's 3 opportunities to then respond to the budget that is given out in July. Once we get to September, we're really in the last month where the budget has to be statutorily filed. So we have to have the budget filed September 30th. The challenge is, in order for the county to produce the pink postcards, they need the certified valuation, which isn't available until August 20th. So we need the certified valuation August 20th. The taxing entities get their information to the county spends out the postcard. So what we expect to be the window for the county-wide pink postcard hearing will be around September 16th through September 19th. And that is truly 10 to 15 days before our budget is due. So there's a lot of preparation and paperwork and publication and documents that go into filing a budget. So that's why we are really trying to push for that community engagement more in the late June, early July, and then with some opportunities in August. So we are also starting school mid-August. So we really need to have a pretty good idea of the budget we're going to adopt when we have students walking in the door. The staff decisions are clearly already made at that point. So there's a little bit of a disconnect between the statutory required public process and when the public process really can engage with budget development. And we wanted to highlight that as we presented the calendar moving forward. So when you think about the community input opportunities, we're talking about 2 public work sessions, 3 public forums, 6 Board of Education meetings, and then an online window for people to participate and give information. We all know that, I'm just a phone call away. The community's open to calling me, and I know that all of you receive communication through emails and phone calls and conversations with people. So we do know that we're open and obviously very transparent and want to have feedback and want to highlight that. I would like to now, from the budget calendar, go on to state aid current law. Mr. Boswell, I will pause for a second if it makes sense, because our topics, maybe are going to feel a little bit different, to see if there's any feedback specifically on the budget calendar.
Any questions or discussion? Ms. Meyer.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Standish, for going and getting us a really clear picture of the calendar. I would encourage the public to engage with board members and with the forums and the online opportunities to give us feedback. I want to emphasize that we've had those kinds of opportunities for at least 2 decades, so that people understand and the public understands that we are a board that's committed to transparency and accountability with our budget. And the one question I have for you is the information for the homestead exemption, which allows retirees or those with certain disabilities to be able to reduce or maybe even eliminate their property tax burden. Is that information available on our web website or a link to a state website for that?
We would need to add that, so that's a really good suggestion. So in this presentation with this meeting, we did provide information about where to go to get information on the homestead exemption. The district would not obviously be the expert on that, but we can provide the community where to go with a link to both Lancaster County, so that's available here in the presentation, but I will follow up with staff and we can put under the budget page for Lincoln Public Schools, you know, kind of just a link that then routes them to the Department of Revenue if they're curious about the homestead exemption. So you're exactly right. This is the homestead exemption for Lancaster County. I just took a screenshot where it talks about the different categories of eligibility, and then there's weighting scales and things that people can access to see if they qualify. There's also the homestead exemption within the Department of Revenue, and the filing deadline for that is June 30th, which is why, as we were as a team reflecting on our processes, we said if we're going to mention the homestead exemption, we really need to do it really early in our process so that people can get to the homestead exemption while the filing window is still open. So we will add that on the budget page for Lincoln Public Schools, and I'll have staff follow up on that, and we have a great team, and I'm sure they'll make it happen.
Great. And can we put the deadline on our calendar so people can see it?
Oh, sure. You bet.
Great. And I want to emphasize to the public, please look at this. I was talking to a neighbor across the street just a year or so ago, and she had heard of it, but she didn't think it would apply for her. And I said, no, look at it. And it did, and it allowed her, I'm just telling this little story so people understand this means you, retirees, and those with disabilities. It allowed her to retire from a part-time job that she was maintaining just because she needed to pay property tax. Then she found out that she was exempt. So please look into this.
It's a great story.
Ms. Mungo.
I will also say that Southeast Community College, I was just looking at their community education for spring, and is doing a information session on the homestead. So I thought, that's great. I'm never, you don't hear about it, and then you're hearing it all over the place. So it looks like in the community itself, there's places you can learn more about it and definitely follow through on it. So.
All right, so now we'll move on and kind of shift gears more to some of the key concepts that we wanted to present related to the information we know today that will impact budget adoption for the 24-25 school year. So we do have state aid certified under current law. We do understand that there are bills in the legislature that could null and void this certification and recertify different numbers, but we did want to share, and we've shared this before, as we expected, needs minus resources equals aid. And our resources went up substantially last year. And we did talk about last year during our budget development process and in our budget work sessions that we were anticipating at that point in time potentially a $25+ million loss in state aid as a reduction for that in response to the rising value. We did have the valuation increase of the 22.5%. The board did lower the levy 14 cents. I mean, that was a historical moment. So this valuation increase was coupled with a response by the Board of Education on the tax levy side. And we are experiencing a reduction in state aid of about $32 million under current law. What's interesting to reflect on in this graph is if you go back to 2018, 2019, that's about a 50% drop. In some pretty quick years. So the rise in valuation and the reduction in state aid with the way equalization works has very much been impacting the school district under current law. So we just wanted to give this information to all of you and to the community. We also watch the shift between property taxes and state aid. So you can see we would expect in 24-25 under current law, we are becoming increasingly reliant on property taxes, less reliant on state aid. That is the way equalization works because Nebraska has prioritized equalization, and that your first funding stream is from your local property tax base. with the idea that property taxes being governed by local boards in local communities, the people closest to the property owners, is kind of the original concept of equalization aid. So those are just some fact points related to state aid. They will tie a little bit into the legislative update. So just to take us back, because I know not everyone is living and breathing this every day, like I am this legislative session, so just to start at the beginning, just to keep in mind, we started with the basis that Governor Pellin had an education finance package in 2023. There were 3 bills that were introduced and passed with concepts that came from a collaborative effort by the governor with senators, with superintendents, with various parties across the state to develop Governor Pellin's education finance package of 2023. So the 3 bills came together, implemented foundation aid, increased special ed reimbursement, established an education future fund. That education future fund prioritizes equalization, then special education and foundation aid, and it implemented a soft property tax cap preserving local control. That soft property tax preserving local control is 3% plus student growth factors, varying demographics. So for Lincoln, that was 3.61 last year, 3.55 total this year, plus local board authority for an additional 4%. We were closely monitoring LB 1316 because it removed the additional board authority, resulting in a hard cap and really eliminating the local control. I'm going to grab my water. On Monday, we received a model from the Nebraska Department of Education that was communicating information to school districts about what was going to be in the property tax reduction package that would be advanced this session, meaning this week, meaning tomorrow. And so when we reflected on that model, we wanted to just provide you an update. We do not have bill language on all of this yet. We do not, so we're operating off of the NDE model for some of this information. But it was, as you can see at the bottom, a funding shift. So from property taxes to state sources for Lincoln Public Schools of almost $150 million through a direct distribution of what is currently the allocated income tax credit that property taxpayers access when they're filing their taxes, and an increase in foundation aid. So this is a part that we do not have bill language on, but based on what was released in the NDE model, we would contemplate, this is the Education Committee arm of the package, on looking at a redistribution or a shift from property taxes to state funding streams. That would also be considered consistent with news coverage that has come out of the workings of the Education Committee and the Revenue Committee. On the property tax side of things, we have been watching the cap conversation very closely because unlike the previous slide where that would be shifting our sources of funding, this could actually be impacting the total. And so one concept that was in the NDE model that was released on the 25th was really taking that board authority and creating 2 buckets. How much of the board authority did the board actually tax for? What was in the tax asking from the previous year? And so what was used? So we're kind of calling that used authority. That authority was used, it was actually taxed for. The second bucket was unused authority. And so the board authorized it, but they didn't tax for it. And we have really circled in on the concept that the used authority was being subtracted from the base for the future years in the NDE model. This was hugely problematic. I think probably the exact same words I used last time about a hard cap, because it does result in a 3% hard cap on schools. So we kind of had this interesting conversation going on where we were saying the board can still vote for the additional authority, But then if it doesn't carry forward into the base, it actually creates a hard cap. So I just want to spend a few minutes on why removing that used authority. So the unused authority, I think it is logical to say that doesn't operate under an unlimited bank. You know, I mean, let's really focus on what you needed and what you used. So the unused authority, we can kind of let that not carry forward because you didn't use it, you didn't tax for it. So we're really focusing in on the used authority and helping people understand why not including used authority in the base, in effect, is a 3% hard cap. So we, of course, have complicating factors here. One is that the special education additional reimbursement was not in the cap for 23-24. So as we look to 24-25, that additional reimbursement will be under the cap. So it will likely be necessary, you know, in the modeling we've done, for the board to really consider that additional authority, not because our total revenue for the school district is going up so much from one year to the other, but because that new revenue is new under the cap. And so that is going to create a circumstance where if we look at the NDE base revenue for 23-24, their base revenue was $509 million. But our actual revenue that we budgeted for 23-24 was $532 million. Because we estimated the additional special education reimbursement, we estimated that at just short of $23 million. So the challenge is the revenue cap for 24-25 at 3.55%, we would actually decrease in revenue from the previous year. So the board, as we go through the budget work, we have a very lengthy process. We just talked about a calendar. In order for revenue to grow 3%, we would have to access the 7.55. So that is all in place. So that can happen. Here's the problem. It's the next year. So the next year, if the used authority is not in the base for 25-26, and let's assume that the board did access the 7.55 and revenue grew about 3% for the school district, we would have to first subtract out that additional board authority of 4%, and NDE would start us at the base of 527 million. They would grow that base by 3%. We would go backwards. Okay, so we would have to access the 7% to actually get 3% growth. And so, Dr. Larson, please don't laugh, but 7 minus 4 is always 3. So 7 minus 4 is, what?
I said in base 10.
Okay. So if you're going to access 7, but they minus 4, you're going to have to access 7, they're going to minus 4 to always get 3. And so we have been working excruciatingly hard to help senators, to help members of the Revenue Committee. I want to thank them. I think John Neal has been having multiple times a day contacts with members of the Revenue Committee, trying to make sure we really fully communicate this concept, which in simple terms is 7 minus 4 always equals 3. When you minus out the 4, the school board will never be able to get above 3, and that it is a hard cap. So it's not that we need everyone to understand all the in and outs that I have here. I have this here just to show my homework. It's really just helping people understand when you don't include that growth in the base, you're creating a hard cap of 3. And we need to be honest about that, and we need to make sure we understand that. And so we know that that hard cap is something we have talked about, that we talked about a month ago, that would have huge implications for schools across the state. We are in a labor shortage. We do need to recruit and retain staff, both in our classified to make sure we have quality teachers, certificated to make sure we have quality teachers, and classified ranks with our unfilled positions. We also know that at 3%, if you're trying to keep up with labor cost, You're either you're reducing teachers and increasing class size, or you're reducing programs. So that, just in a capstone, is kind of a reminder of our conversation about why a 3% cap does not work for the future of public education in the state of Nebraska. So the one thing that did happen today is we did actually get Amendment 3202. So that was filed late in the afternoon, just a few hours ago, really. And it does not include the concept that was in the NDE model. So it does not include putting the base and then reducing the additional board authority the following year. So the problem I just described that was apparent in the NDE model that was released yesterday, I can't believe it's only Tuesday. Okay, it was released yesterday, is not present in the current amendment. And huge thank you to the senators that were listening as we were trying to explain how problematic that was. Now that also means we need to keep a really close eye on the tax package as it proceeds to make sure that there aren't any additional changes that then result in a similar consequence. So that gives you the backdrop of some of the problems that we have been working on, some of the challenges we've been facing, and then also kind of lets you know the current state at this moment of the new amendment that was filed this afternoon. We are anticipating that AM 388, which was the placeholder for the sales tax conversation, with AM 3203 will possibly be debated as early as tomorrow. I know that John Neal and myself will also be available to senators to make sure we're really clear throughout that debate on what any twists or turns or changes might be. I would probably pause just to see if Dr. Neal has anything to add to how I described things or any additional context.
I would just reiterate how great it's been to work with the senators that represent Lincoln Public Schools. They do a great job of listening very carefully to the concerns of our district and weighing them with the concerns of being senators for the whole state as well. And they've done an amazing job in the package that's come out right now. And we're pleased that it doesn't do the damage that we were worried about. So, and also throughout all my conversations with senators, the first question they ask is, does Liz say that's true? And then I say yes. And then they say, okay, then I believe that. That's good. And we can go on. And that's not just the senators from Lincoln, that's the senators from all across the state. So we're very fortunate to have Dr. Standish play the role she does for Lincoln and really for the state of Nebraska.
So my final slide, and then I'll open it up to comments and questions, is we did have a lot of conversation at our last meeting about how if we move towards a hard cap, how that would substantially change the local ability of a school board to have visions for the community, to implement additional early childhood, to say we're going to have a bond issue and we're going to build a career academy. You know, it would really limit the ability for an individual community to have aspirations for what their school district could do, because you would be really just trying to make it day to day within the 3% cap. And losing that authority to the state would be really problematic. So with that, Mr. Boswell, I'm available for any questions the board members might have.
Mrs. Danek.
Thank you, President Boswell. Okay, so I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, and I watched the legislature and I didn't get it all. So the hard cap versus taking it away. If I'm looking at what was on the beginning part of the slide, it's like freezing us at 3% for eternity.
Yes.
So it means that no increases in wages?
Not above a 3%. I
Well,
mean, our revenue would be allowed to grow 3%, plus the variables of student, you know, that could result in a 3.5 or, you know, currently 3.5.
Yeah, I'm looking
So
at
our
one-
revenue would be able to grow 3%.
I'm looking at $2 million for milk. So I guess I'm thinking about it in a different context. It's just like your budget at home. If you don't get a raise in your paycheck, everything else starts to cost more, and you still see a reduction in what you have to spend on other things. So that cap, while they didn't call it a cap, they just kept saying, well, you should be able to live on 3%. That's not how labor negotiations work, is it?
No, and I think you're highlighting what we really worked hard to shed light on, that if you're going to retain the board authority, but you're going to put any of that board authority and subtract it from the base, you're really not retaining the board authority. And I think you're highlighting, kind of what we've been working to highlight as this idea of subtracting it from the base seemed to emerge.
We had significant conversation earlier about how fantastic our staff is and how we're trying to work to help them, and the needs that we saw within even just that presentation that they didn't ask for, and we wouldn't have any ability to even put those needs into a package if they were to go ahead and freeze everything at a 3%.
A really good example, Mrs. Danek, would be counselors in schools. This
Yes.
board of work has worked really hard to bring a counselor to every school in the school district. We actually still have work to do. We still have some counselors that are grant funded, and so our budget proposals for the next series of years will continue to have requests for things like counselors in schools. And so that's a really good example of where there's really things that the school district continues to work at very diligently over a series of years that would be taken away with a hard 3% cap.
And I was thinking about early childhood that we've had as a board goal for several years, probably more than 5, of increasing the number of early childhood classrooms. And I know we have a lot of discussion that even if we tried to increase them, we don't have enough space. We don't have enough teachers. This would never give us an opportunity to make any headway on all of those things. And I'm watching some policymakers just say, well, you need to do more with less. And to the men and women that teach and work in the LPS, I'm going to say they work their tails off every single solitary day. So I find that to be an offensive comment out of a policymaker who doesn't understand what it's like to run a school, and they probably need to get in and watch a teacher teach. So thank you for presenting this very directly.
Any further discussion? Would any portion of the potential $147 million shift be subtracted from equalization aid? If not, how many cents of levy is $147 million?
We have not calculated how many cents of levy is the 147 million, so we would need to do that. We also wouldn't want to get out in front of the budget build process and the levy decisions of the board, so we would do that very cautiously. We would clearly be a foundation aid funded school district. I will tell you, going into next year, we are a little bit equalized with the new 1,500 foundation. So we're not foundation aid funded only yet. We are still a little bit equalized under current law, but under a 3,000 model, we would be fully we would be a foundation aid funded school district.
Thank you. Ms. Beyer.
Yeah, I just wanted to observe that with a hard cap of 3%, that would mean that we really couldn't go and respond to crises like tornadoes, inflation that affects the whole country, student needs that may be increasing for a variety of different issues. Is that correct?
I would say definitely for the student needs. Our uninsured loss fund is funded from our general fund, so that would lead you to say that, kind of the crisis scenario would be real. So yeah, I do believe you're correct, Ms. Beyer. Yeah.
So, and then ultimately this takes away local control. And I think that in Nebraska, it's just an observation that it's a value that us Nebraskans hold dearly, is local control, particularly of our educational institutions. So I'm just really glad, as Dr. Neal has mentioned, that you and Dr. Neal have put so much effort into going and being a resource to our state senators and the governor's office on what the real impacts of this are. Because on the surface, it sounds good. But in the reality, it's taking away local control. And local control means that we get to respond to crises like tornadoes and student needs and inflation. So thank you very much for your work.
Ms. Mungard.
So I know you, Dr. Standish, and you are not the sky is falling kind of person at all. Because sometimes when I listen to this, it feels like the sky is falling, and like because we have only certain things we as a board are to do. One of our big things is to create a budget in which can run the district in a manner in which we as elected officials in the community feel we should be running for our community. So what I'm hearing you saying is that at this point today, we're still holding our breath a little bit because the decisions have not been made, and that when will those decisions be made? Do we have an idea of
10 days.
the legislature with the voting aspect? Because I don't hear the sky is falling, but I hear that it's getting very heavy above our heads.
I think it's important to understand that there's a concept that we saw in the NDE modeling that was different than outright striking through the board authority, which was a little bit clearer of we're going to remove local control and we're going to have a hard cap, where this idea that we're not going to include the base of that used authority in the out year is another angle at accomplishing the same goal. So we are concerned about that concept. We've been shedding light on that concept. We've been highlighting that concept to make sure that everyone understands that is another method to get a 3% hard cap. That is not present in the amendment that was filed this afternoon, which is a hold your breath good news. And I'll let Dr. Neal kind of talk about the legislative process and how that will work moving forward as the bill is debated.
Sure. The amendment that includes this change from what we saw in the NDE model was just introduced today, so it was read across today as part of LB 388, and then the amendment that went with it. So the earliest it can be on the agenda is tomorrow, and that's the anticipation. We're getting very shortened days. It'll likely be debated tomorrow. For first round general file debate, it could run up to 8 hours, so it could be quite lengthy, because our piece of that bill is a very small piece, a very important piece, but a very small piece. It's a larger tax bill from the Revenue Committee that involves lots of moving parts, so it'll be quite an extensive debate. We'll be listening very carefully for the parts that have to do with education, specifically this part of the amendment. It was in a 62-page amendment. It was 12 words on 2 lines on page 61, but they were very important words, and so we'll continue to listen for those tomorrow. If it moves off general file tomorrow, it has to sit a day, and then it'll come back on select file. That won't be till next week, because if it's debated on Wednesday, it has to sit on Thursday, and then we're off Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, so it starts to get closer and closer to the end of the session. The most important day is probably tomorrow. We'll learn the most about where senators stand, where senators vote, what we'll hear talked about aloud during the session. So I appreciate Dr. Standish putting aside her other duties and being able to spend the time down in the rotunda with me, working with senators and listening to that conversation.
And I just also want to say, I want to thank you and thank the exec team for the board to make a decision for us to have this in a public conversation, because this would often be something that we would be struggling through in our finance committee and listening to you, and you have pulled me a long way in being able to actually follow you, and your slides are great, but I think it's really important because it's like we have to hear that in some ways we're a little bit powerless in what we just went through, this whole process of how we're going to be transparent to our community on how to create a $500 million budget, and yet we're a little bit powerless in being able to say at this point in time what can we really even start looking towards building on, maintaining, and pulling back on. And that's really what we're going to have a hard job of doing. So if the community is listening, the reality is when we start those conversations in June, it is impacted by what's happening right now. And so I appreciate you educating us all on how do we look at this and how can we translate it into what can be done here in our own community and or what will happen within our community if they move forward and say, but we still want this cap because, you know, we think you spend too much money. It'll be a hardship on it'll be a hardship on us because we'll have to make some really hard decisions. And it would be a hardship on the community because we will have to make decisions that will impact classrooms, individuals, and their kids. I mean, if you think, you know, we don't listen enough to kids now, wait till our classrooms all have to be larger than we want them to be. So I appreciate taking the time for us to all hear this and try to struggle through together and understanding how to hold our breath.
Any further discussion? Are there any further reports from board committees?